You could ask a car right now, whether that's a Tesla, whether that's a Mercedes, whether that's a Waymo car, to drive on pretty much any freeway in the United States or in Europe, and it would drive autonomously.
Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Welcome into another episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. Our regular listeners know that we are on a little bit of an autonomous vehicle, a self-driving kick, as it may be. Here on the Tech Ed Podcast, these are technologies that, for whatever reason, absolutely fascinate me. I am Matt Kirkner, your host, and we're going to have a great conversation today. I'm going to start out by telling you that our guest is, first of all, really, really smart. You do not earn a PhD in computer science from USC without being really, really smart. I will also tell you that he is wonderfully funny, and that sense of humor is going to come out over the course of our conversation. He also has this uncanny ability to take really, really complex and advanced topics and put them into words and concepts and analogies that people like me can understand. So it's going to be a really down-to-earth and fascinating conversation with the director of the Center for Autonomous Vehicle and Sensor Systems at Texas A&M University, Dr. Sri Saripalli. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Matt. I'm delighted to be here. And as you said, I hope that I can put these complex technologies into simple words.
You know, when we think about the way that Hollywood portrays modern robotics, that isn't necessarily the way robots act. That's not necessarily the way that those of us who spend time in the field in the world of robotics think about robots. What is it like to be a field roboticist here in the age of 2022?
If you look at Hollywood, you would expect that robots are really, really smart and they are superhuman or super robotic, if you want to use the right word. But as a field roboticist, I can tell you that robots are really, really dumb right now. And the goal really is to use robots for the dull, dirty, and the dangerous tasks that we want to use, right? Dull tasks are things like driving. You know, all of us have been in situations where we have thought, if only I don't have to drive, I could do something else while driving, while going to work, things like that, right? Dirty tasks are, we do a lot of stuff where we are like, if only there was a robot that could do this, right? And dangerous tasks, of course, when you don't want to do something that puts you in trouble or in harm's way, you don't want to do that, right? That's what robotics really is about.
So when you think about this whole idea of only if there was a robot that could, for instance, drive my vehicle, that's certainly, as you mentioned, something that a lot of us would think of as a dull task, although I can tell you that I've ridden in some cars and with some drivers that made driving anything but dull. That's certainly another story. But because of that, and because of the focus on taking robotics and taking autonomous vehicles and finding modern day applications for these technologies, your organization and your work at Texas A&M University takes you into all these interesting discussions and research projects in the world of autonomous vehicles, in the world of sensor systems. So give our audience a really kind of a broad picture of the kinds of projects your team is working on, kind of research that you're able to do.
So very broadly, I want to say we work on two different kinds of projects. One set of projects broadly deal with how do we get self-driving cars, self-driving trucks, self-driving forklifts, self-driving, let's say, any system out into the world so that people can use it for everyday tasks. So that's one set. And then the other set is really, we work a lot with the Department of Defense on how do you get these vehicles that can drive themselves in very, very complex situations where there are bad guys and where you do not know where you are. And really, you do not have any infrastructure. So things like GPS that we take for granted and maps that we take for granted are not available, right? So one set of situations, we are looking at how do we make life easier for people. And in the other set of situations, we are looking at how do we make these vehicles that can help us so that we can make things safer for our country.
So it's all about making things easier, all about making things safer. Who would have imagined, 10, 15 years ago that we'd be sitting here in the year 2022 and saying that we take things like GPS for granted? Of course, I remember the advent of that technology and how amazing it seemed maybe 15 years ago, where we could put our paper maps away and now use an autonomous system to help us get where it is that we're going. In fact, not too long ago, I had an individual that I work with that was talking about making a trip to a place in Minnesota. And I said, I've never heard of that town in Minnesota. Where is that? And he paused for a moment, and his answer was, well, my GPS knows. And that's how far we've come with some of those technologies. And that research has taken a while, and that evolution took a while. But here we are in the year 2022 with amazing technology like GPS. In some cases, research can take a while. And one of the things, Sri, that really impressed me as you and I were talking, and I was getting a better understanding of the types of research that you do, is really the time frame on which you do it. I think when people think about research into emerging technologies, research projects, grant-funded research projects, you think 2, 3, 4, 5-year projects where we have this really long horizon of doing development, of doing research. You take a totally different view of that, and your research is quite different. How does your belief, number one, that it's okay to fail, we talked about that, influence the research you do, and also just tell our audience about the really tight timeframes on which you do some of these research projects?
Yes, definitely. So I'm a field roboticist. What that means is that we want to develop robots that actually work in the real world. In a sense, what we are trying to do is take a lot of things that are developed by different researchers, right? And then ask the question, really, is this something that will work today, that will work in the next 6 months, that will work in the next year? And then see if we can combine those technologies to make something that's useful right now, right? So there are faculty and researchers who work in timeframes of 10, 15, 20 years, right? And that's definitely very, very useful. But in robotics, particularly with technologies such as machine learning and deep learning and sensors, things are changing at such a rapid rate that what we have done a year back, we can do it now much cheaper, better, and quicker, right? For example, about 10 years back, if you wanted to buy a laser sensor, a LiDAR, which really kind of uses lasers to tell you where things are, right? It would cost $100,000. Right now, it costs about $6,000. And I can bet you that in 5 years, it's probably going to cost like $60, right? And so we look at technologies, we specifically look at how do we take things that are available right now and how do we advance the state of the art in the next 2 years or 3 years or 5 years.
And I love that horizon. It's amazing on our podcast how often this whole idea of what I call the exponential economy comes up. And that's the idea that products are doubling in price performance every 12 to 18 months. As you well know, Sri, it ties back to the whole concept of Moore's Law and our ability to process information and that speed at which we can process data doubling every 1 to 2 years. That was posited by Gordon Moore way back in the 50s and 60s. But that continues through today. And I think the example that you just offered about laser sensors and the cost reductions in that technology over time, over a really short period of time, is a really astute one and an interesting one, and also speaks to the importance of having in some sectors this short horizon on research, which again, as I mentioned in the question, was something that really fascinated me about the work that you're doing, is these quick turns that you're doing on the research. And I know that your funding sources, your partners certainly appreciate those quick results as well. That's taking place across a variety of technologies. We've talked about the work with the DoD. We've talked about self-driving vehicles. And I want to stay on that latter topic here for just a little bit. Without a doubt, self-driving car technology, it's a huge trending conversation point in 2022. You can't open up the newspaper. You can't go on to a technology website. You can't turn on the news without hearing something about Google or Waymo or, some other new self-driving car technology. Why do you think this is such an attractive research topic in this day and age?
That's an interesting question, right? People have been working on robotics for a long, long time, right? And in Hollywood, you see all kinds of robots. But I think the reason why self-driving cars are such a hot topic is because we all know how to drive and we all understand, or we think we understand how to drive. So if you put a computer, which is really what a self-driving technology is, in a situation where it doesn't understand what it needs to do, you could ask pretty much anyone in the United States who has a driving license, and they will tell you what needs to happen, right? They'll tell you, okay, you're on the road, you need to do a 3 point turn, right? So they'll tell you, okay, go left, back up a little, then turn again, right? And that's basically an algorithm. All of us are telling basically how do you solve this particular problem, right? And then it's really up to the computer or the person who's writing this algorithm to take those instructions and then put them into the computer so that the computer can solve it, right? So we all think, hey, this is something that I've been doing every day. So why don't a computer do it so that I could be doing something else, right? So that's fascinating.
So it's really interesting the ability of individuals to relate to this whole idea of self-driving technology, where we think about maybe using artificial intelligence, deep learning, machine learning in the area of robotics. Well, not everybody knows a robot intimately, right? Some of us know what it's like to jog a robot and what macros are and what dual check safety is and what end of arm tools are. But you've really got to be in that space in order to be talking that language. On the other hand, anybody who's driving a car can relate exactly to this whole idea of self-driving vehicles, of autonomy, of the benefits that self-driving vehicles will eventually bring. And I know that in your view, because we've talked about it, Sri, we're a long way along the path of getting to self-driving vehicles. In fact, I was watching an interview with Elon Musk not long ago that we're going to reference, I think, a little later in our discussion, where he had said the average vehicle, the average Tesla today has enough sensors and enough devices on it to be able to drive itself. There's just some puzzles that need to be completed. I think the number that you offered me when we talked, Sri, was that we've kind of figured out probably 90 to 95% of self-driving vehicles, but it's, in your words, the last 5 or 10% that's tricky. Tell us about what is all included as a starter. What's all included in this 95% that we've already figured out when it comes to autonomy?
Yeah. So I think that what you just said, which is we probably have the right set of sensors and we probably have the right set of computing for doing this, right? Again, that's a true statement. I mean, yes, there might be some cases where those sensors and that computing might not work, but most of the cases, I think that will work, right? So the 90 to 95%, I think you could ask a car right now, whether that's a Tesla, whether that's a Mercedes, whether that's a Waymo car, to drive on pretty much any freeway in the United States or in Europe, and it would drive autonomously. So that covers, I don't know, probably 70% of the driving situations. I think most of the advanced cars could do lane following and lane keeping, right? In most of the situations, you could think of saying, okay, if I have to go from my house to say work, if I could take a Waymo right now, I think it would be able to do that 99% of the time, right? So, but it's the situations that we are not prepared for, right? Let's say you're driving and suddenly a water main breaks in front of you and there's water there. So what do? And there's a car behind you that's honking, so you can't turn and things like that. And you have to do something. You just can't sit there and say, well, I don't know what to do, right? So that's where the computer fails because the computer has never seen this situation. So it doesn't have common sense, right? What we call as common sense. And it's not common sense. It's something that we know instinctively. I was not taught what to do, right? But almost all of us would figure out maybe we go into the opposite lane, right? And we are driving in the wrong lane and we can do that and then come back, right? And that's against the rule. So can a computer do this? Right now, no, right? And that's the 5%. These are the situations that we have not thought about, but we kind of learn about them through experience. And these are the kind of things that I don't think the self-driving cars right now can solve. And that's the 5% that needs to be solved.
So the 5% is really that part of it where an individual, a human being, is applying some level of common sense. I think it was Benjamin Franklin that said common sense isn't always so common, but at least we have more common sense sometimes and more intuition than say a computer that's just following an algorithm, following a set of instructions or rules around what exactly it's supposed to do. So it will be fascinating as folks like you continue to do this research into that last 5%. By the way, you mentioned Mercedes, you mentioned Tesla, you mentioned Waymo. I would ride in any one of those. I've always been a little bit of a Mercedes guy, but I think I'd take any one of them. Waymo just this week I saw an article. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal that they're going to start driving Google employees around San Francisco. They've had Google cars or Waymo cars in Arizona for some number of years, but they're going to start driving the employees around San Francisco. So that'll be a fascinating experiment to watch here as we watch that project roll out. I don't know. Do you have a favorite? Tesla, Mercedes, Waymo? If you had to pick which one of those you could ride to work, what's your pick, Sri?
Oh, that's a hard question, and you're putting me in a spot.
You don't want to offend any of your research partners either, I suppose.
So I am, from a purely car perspective, definitely a Mercedes or a BMW fan. I'll say that, and I'll leave it at that.
Fair enough. I'll admit that I have a 1987 560 SL that definitely does not drive itself. That thing needs all kinds of help, but it's a beautiful vehicle. So you and I would probably share that affinity. So we've talked all about cars that drive on the road, whether it's a Mercedes, it's a Tesla, it's a Waymo vehicle driving around the city of San Francisco. As you suggested when we started off today, you're doing a tremendous amount of work with the Department of Defense as well around off-road self-driving vehicles, and which adds, as I've begun to understand from our discussions, a whole separate level of complication in terms of the technology that rides along in an off-road vehicle. So talk a little bit about some of the unique challenges that you run into when you're trying to teach an off-road vehicle to drive autonomously.
So the way to think about off-road versus on-road vehicles. On-road, there is a road, which means that you know exactly where to drive, right? It's black or maybe it's brown, depending on where you are. There are road lanes, there are lane lines. You need to be inside the lanes. And anything that comes on the road is kind of like an obstacle that you need to either avoid or stop for. In off-road situations, you don't know where to drive. There are bushes, and beneath the bushes, there could be water, there could be quicksand, there could be something else. It looks like sand, but you go there and your wheels could get stuck. There could be a boulder that could be sinking. So it's, in a more technical term, you don't know where the load-bearing surface is, where you can actually take the vehicle and go there. And then once you've figured out where to drive, there are obstacles through which you can drive through. Bushes, small things, you can drive through them. Big tree trunks, you shouldn't drive through them. You shouldn't hit them, right? So, and then you can't see far enough. It's not a flat surface. It's usually, there are hills, there are things like that. It's a very complicated thing where you're trying to figure out where to drive, then what to avoid, what to hit, and then how to drive, right? In the on-road scenario, you kind of know where to drive, and you're just trying to figure out what to avoid. The biggest thing in on-road is there are other drivers and human beings, pedestrians. And so that is the biggest problem to solve in on-road. In off-road, figuring out where to drive is the big problem.
Fascinating. As you were going through that answer, it kind of took me, I'm a cyclist, right? And in every version of cycling. So I raced road bikes for a while. I raced cyclocross for a while. I've ridden mountain bikes for more than 30 years. And it's really, there's this analogy that popped into my head where if I'm on my road bike and I'm in a peloton with a group of other people, I really just have to pay attention to what everybody else is doing, as long as I'm staying on the wheel of the rider in front of me and I'm not creating a dangerous situation. To your point, you kind of stay within the lines, although I don't know that I'm always really good in the rest of my life at staying within the lines. On a road bike, I typically was. And then you get into, on a mountain bike and you're riding off road and you're on a trail and there's a tree or a stump or a bush or a root or a rock or all these other things that you're trying to find your way around. It's not that one is impossible, but it certainly adds another layer of complexity and another layer of decision making. So that is some really interesting research that you're doing along with the DoD, and I've got to believe that a lot of that work has applications. Then, if we can make an autonomous vehicle tell the difference between a bush and a tree and a car, and understand, what's a road and what isn't and where it's supposed to go, that's got to have tremendous applications on the on-road side of the world as well, right? So a lot of this crosses over.
Yes, and it's very interesting, right? So if you ask a human, hey, why did you not hit that bush? And why did you go through that tree? We don't really know the answer, right?
Right.
It's like maybe you've seen a picture somewhere of a bush and you kind of said, oh, this is not a scary bush, if you want to say,
right.
so I can drive through this. Right. So a lot of it comes back to kind of experience or what we have gone through. Right. And sometimes you just kind of wing it, you don't know anything. So I'm just going to floor my accelerator and then to go through it. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when can you do that? When do you need to floor the gas pedal and go through something? When do you need to be careful? These are interesting things. These are decisions that we do every day in our life while driving, whether on road or off road. We don't have a rule book for this, and so whenever we are doing this, while we are only talking about autonomous vehicles, right, the more you develop these technologies, that could be used for improving, if you want to call it AI, artificial intelligence, right? This is how we develop better artificial intelligence, because we are kind of picking it at one piece at a time and kind of asking the question, can we solve this problem? Can we solve this problem? And they're very small problems, but as we solve them, we understand a little bit more about how to solve the entire problem.
And it's interesting. It really comes back to a concept that repeats itself quite often on the Tech Ed podcast, which is this whole idea of converging technologies across different spaces. And in as much as a lot of the research that you're doing is centered around robotics and autonomous vehicles, that has applications across almost every space of the economy and every different segment and every different market. So it is interesting how that theme is a continuing theme, almost regardless of the guests that we have on the podcast. So really fascinating answer that you offered. I, for one, I've been guilty of winging it when I'm driving my car. I think we all have at one point in the time. I don't think I want to ride in an autonomous vehicle that's winging it. That sounds a little bit terrifying to me.
So yes, that's interesting, right? So when you have an autonomous car and you're winging it, you call it an algorithm. California, if you are merging onto the freeway, has a very strict set of rules as to how to merge onto the freeway. You need to have about 3 cars distances before you can merge onto the freeway. In real life, if you're in Los Angeles, and I've lived in Los Angeles, if you try to do this, you can never do this, right? So if you write a algorithm that follows the Department of Motor Vehicles rule book and you make an autonomous vehicle, that vehicle will not move, right? So you kind of have to break the rule for the vehicle to actually merge in, right? And that poses very interesting legal and ethical questions, which I'm not sure where we go. So what if an autonomous vehicle intentionally exceeds the speed limit because it has to merge in? And now there's actually a log of that autonomous vehicle right. Exceeding the speed limit. So what do you do with it?
Yeah, it takes me back to an interview I saw. This is probably 25 years ago, where an individual, in this case happened to be a woman, was being interviewed and was asked about what are the 3 lights in what we in Wisconsin call a stop and go light or a stoplight. What do those 3 colors mean? And she said, well, the red one, that means stop, and the green one, that means go, and the yellow one, that means floor it. And it's like, well, okay. You can't really tell a computer or a self-driving car that same thing. In either event, all of these, you think about the technology that tells a self-driving vehicle you need to maintain 3 car lengths, or you have to look in your rearview mirror, and if you see what's coming, from the left side of the vehicle as it's merging onto the interstate. All this requires some really interesting smart sensor technology. And speaking of this whole convergence of technologies, we talk a lot on this podcast about smart sensors, about the ability to have a sensor that can communicate with other sensors without having to go back through a computer network, that has embedded intelligence, that makes decisions for itself. And this is at the heart of just about every innovation that's taking place across IoT technology, Industry 4.0, advanced manufacturing, autonomous vehicles. It's just common in every single area that's advancing. I know you spend a ton of time in the world of smart sensor technology. It's right in the sensor systems part of your title. So talk a little bit, Sri, about some emerging trends that you see in the types of smart sensors that are coming along the pike?
That's a very interesting question because I jokingly tell people that every time we get a better sensor, suddenly robotics becomes much more smarter, right? So you can take the old algorithm, which kind of used to work, and put a nicer sensor with it, and suddenly that thing works amazingly well, right? I think what I've seen over the last decade is different kinds of sensors. So, pretty much to give you an idea, if you take a camera looks at things that we can see and it gives you a picture of what we are seeing. So, this is the camera that's there on your iPhone. This is the camera, your camera with which you take photos, right? Now, if you take a LiDAR sensor, it's still in the same spectrum, so the same spectrum of light, except that you can't see that light, except it's still giving you a picture. It's a different kind of picture, but it's still looking at the same thing, right? And then you have sensors that go about and look at the same spectrum, but either much further along the spectrum, right? Radar looks at much further along the spectrum. And then there are sensors like dermal sensors, which look at in a different part of the spectrum, right? So what's happening is previously all these sensors used to be only used for Department of Defense, right? But now these sensors are available. So now you can combine all these sensors, and that's how you can get like superhuman vision, if you want to call it, right? So because the vehicle can see pretty much through fog, through rain, through nighttime, so it has much more, or not just a vehicle, pretty much anything, it has a lot more time to decide on what we want to do, right? And the way I tell it to people is, so I have pretty big glasses, so really I can't see that far. When I'm driving, a lot of times I make decisions based on not my eyesight, right? So based on my experience of driving, and I keep a little bit further distance from vehicles, things like that. But if you can see further, then you have a lot more time to actually plan what you're doing, right? And that's what these sensors are doing. So you have different kinds of sensors. These sensors are becoming smaller. These sensors are becoming much more smarter, like you've said. So they have computers embedded on them. And when you combine these different sensors, then you can make more things happen with them.
So smaller and more embedded intelligence. They're becoming smarter. They're also becoming less and less expensive. So that's the exponential economy at work, and that's another reason why they're proliferating in the way that they are. You know, you just made a really interesting point that I have to be honest with you, I'm embarrassed that I never thought about, but I haven't. You know, we talked earlier about who wouldn't want a smart or a self-driving car where you could stay busy doing other things, not driving the vehicle. And the answer to that is I think there are some people that don't want them because they're afraid of it. They can't imagine a computer and a series of smart sensors and devices operating a vehicle more safely than an individual can. I think many of us who have been around the technology probably recognize that there are tons of advantages from a safety standpoint to autonomous vehicles. But I had not thought about the fact that, you know, driving through fog, which can be absolutely terrifying and incredibly dangerous, if I've now got a sensor that can see beyond where my eyes can, that becomes a much, much safer environment. And that's just an observation I hadn't thought of at all. So thank you for sharing that one with us. You know, obviously any of this only works if we've got good artificial intelligence, good machine learning, good algorithms, you know, that we've done a tremendous amount of research and work into. When it comes to AI and ML, we've really just scratched the surface. You've already told us a little bit about some of the applications with self-driving car research and how environmental factors prevent challenges to algorithms. That, you know, if it's seeing something on a road it's used to seeing, that's one thing. If it all of a sudden encounters a situation that it hasn't seen before, it has no idea what to do. And when you and I were talking about that earlier this week, we got onto this whole concept of generalized artificial intelligence. So what is that? How do the rules of nature impact our ability to design generalized algorithms?
So right now, what we can do is we have a lot of data, right? And we can look at that data and we can infer some things from the data. And we become very smart at it. Actually, some of these computers are much, much smarter than what we can do, right? So right now, there are these neural networks and deep learning algorithms that can actually write a book, definitely better than what I can write and probably better than some of the other people there. And you cannot tell the difference between what they've written versus what an author has written, right? All they're doing is they're taking the data and they're able to figure out how you can combine data in various ways so that you can create new things. What they don't know is if they see something that they've never seen, how do you infer from that, right? What we call common sense. So, for example, I'm going on a street, I see a dog barking at me, like a really big dog barking at me and comes towards me. I've never seen a dog before, and I see this dog. So then the next time I go on the street, and if I see a big dog, then I know that I need to stay away from that dog because something bad can happen, right? This idea of this common sense, things that I've seen from, or somebody tells me this, and then I can say, aha, that happened. The common sense is now if I see another big animal, I know that I should stay away from it, not just a dog, right? And if it looks scary, I should stay away from it. This is not something that you just get from data.
Sure.
So you can currently say, okay, AI can probably recognize dogs, and if dogs, and I like dogs, I have dogs, so just let me make that clear. But AI right now could probably say, well, if you see something scary, you should stay away from it. But it can't generalize that to if you see something similar or maybe even different, but that at the same proportions, you should stay away. So that's generalization that you can't do, right? The other thing is causality. And there's right now we can't do this, right? So if A follows B and B follows C, we can say that A follows C, right? So
sure.
that inference is something that is really, really hard for the current machine learning or deep learning or AI, right? So artificial general intelligence is being able to do this, to be able to have common sense. A simple way of understanding this is we have Siri, and Siri can translate for us. So I don't know Spanish, but if I say something in English, and my daughter does this all the time, she plays with it, so she wants to learn Spanish, so she asks Siri and it translates for us, right? But Siri doesn't understand it. It is just translating word by word. So you get some very funny sentences when you translate from English to Spanish, right? But that understanding, being able to condense the sentence and be able to do that is lacking right now, right? And that's what artificial general intelligence is, right? And to get there, I think we need some very fundamental work in AI. That's a research question that could probably take 5 years, that could probably take 10 years, is how do we get from where we are right now to be able to have artificial general intelligence?
So from where we are to where we're going in the future, that's a perfect tee up for the next question. Sri, we can't have a conversation about autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars and advancements in the transportation sector without the name Elon Musk dropping into the discussion. He's already presented himself once in this podcast. We talked about him a little bit earlier. I'm going to ask you a question. It's actually the same question that I posed to David Noyce, who is he leads autonomous vehicle research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was watching this video on YouTube. This goes back probably 2 months, maybe 3 months, and they were interviewing Elon Musk. And what he said, I alluded to this earlier. He said, look, in 10 years, you won't be able to buy a car. You won't be able to buy a new car that isn't self-driving. You literally will not be able to go to a dealership, not be able to order a new vehicle that doesn't drive itself. And then he said, in fact, we have enough smart technology, we have enough hardware on the current Tesla to be able to allow it to drive itself. The question is letting some of the other things, that other 5% you referenced earlier, catch up with the hardware and the technology. So Elon Musk predicted that in 10 years, you won't be able to drive a car that isn't self-driving. Do you agree? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
So I do agree, but I agree to the weaker version of it. Just like you have strong AI, like artificial general intelligence, and say the current AI. And this is my opinion. I don't think a autonomous self-driving car would be able to solve all the situations that gets thrown at it unless we make some fundamental breakthroughs in AI. Okay. So right now, if you ask me the question, self-driving cars in 10 years, you won't be able to buy one. I would say, yes, you would have most of these safety features, because even if you can't do self-driving 100% of the time, getting self-driving 95% of the time is very, very useful just because of the safety that it provides. It's exactly like cell phones. 10 years back, I loved my Motorola, my Nokia, the thing where you can press buttons and then you can call people, which was not a smartphone that you can throw around anywhere and it would survive and things like that. last week I was trying to find one of those phones to buy just because I got nostalgic. You can't buy one.
Huh.
All you can buy are these smartphones. So I think that statement is true. It probably will be very hard to buy a vehicle without all these safety features. Whether that would be fully self-driving, I know we are splitting hairs here as to what fully self-driving is, but whether we are fully self-driving, I think that's a ways off.
So first of all, very political answer. So
well, okay. I hate making political answers, so let me be more direct, right? Because I think as faculty, we shouldn't be political and we should be direct. So I'll put myself in spot. I don't think we'll have fully self-driving cars in 10 years. How about that?
All right. It's interesting. I will tell you, and I didn't let on to this before in asking the question, David Noyce said the same thing. And he said a lot of the technology will be there, but if I'm putting words in his mouth, but if he has to put his money on it, we won't be fully self-driving in 10 years. So there's going to be, we're going to schedule 10 years from now, Melissa, our producer, Melissa Martin. Let's put the date on the calendar. We're going to have Sri Saripalli. We're going to have David Noyce. We're going to have Elon Musk all on the podcast together. And we'll see which one of you was right, whether or not we can buy a car that isn't self-driving.
Oh, I have a very funny historical anecdote regarding that. So Ernest Rutherford, the person who basically talked about the atomic structure, I believe in 1940s, he said that nuclear fission was impossible when asked. He gave a lecture and he said, just impossible. You can never do it because you cannot break the atom. And I apologize, I forgot the name of the person, but he listened to the lecture. He got very, very annoyed. And then he went back and in 16 hours showed that you can break an atom using neutrons, right? So just putting it out there.
Yeah, right. And if that was in the 40s, within 5 years, of course, we had accomplished that. And many would say put an end to a war. There's the other one. I forget exactly the person, the head of the U.S. Patent Office, and I forget the year. I think it was late 1800s. It said that anything that would be invented had already been invented and we wouldn't have any new inventions.
Yes, I don't remember the name of the person, but I do remember that statement. Yeah,
exactly. So one final question. Sri Saripalli, by the way, is our guest today on the Tech Ed podcast. He's the director of the Center for Autonomous Vehicles and Sensor Systems at Texas A&M University. I promised a really intelligent guest. I promised somebody who was funny. I promised somebody who could bring really complex topics down to earth. I think we've accomplished all three of those. And as we finish our time today, Sri, we're going to ask you the same question we ask every guest here on the Tech Ed podcast. And that is, if you could give one piece of advice to a high school sophomore as they consider their future, what would that piece of advice be?
Well, one piece would be learn math and history. I guess that's two pieces of advice, but I think and have fun. So that's three pieces of advice. But history, because, it's very important to know what has happened and how that leads to something. So I consider history as something that every engineer should know. Math, because I think, that's fundamental for everything that we do. And if we are not having fun, then there's no point in doing it.
Exactly. Especially math as we look to the future and as algorithms and machine learning, artificial intelligence become more and more a part of our way of life, and understanding the logic behind that and understanding the math behind that, incredibly important, and understanding history and where we've been so that we know where we're going. And we've certainly spent plenty of time today talking about where we're going in the world of smart sensors, smart technology, autonomous vehicles, research. You've been a splendid guest. We've had a wonderful time. Appreciate you being on with us, Sri.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you like this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.